There's a 2019 study by Jonathan Haidt that I've used several times in my videos, called Ideological Differences in the Expanse of the Moral Circle. The TLDR of the study is that political differences between left and right-leaning people are not simply due to disagreements over policy, but reflect the core psychological differences between the two, where the former's moral concern is universal, covering more groups of people but less structured, while the latter's is parochial, covering fewer groups but more structured. Basically, left-wing compassion is wide-reaching but shallow, while right-wing compassion is exclusionary but deep. This graph from the study has turned into a meme in right-wing spaces online right now. The whole moral circles don't lie thing. I'm sure you've seen it. These are two heat maps indicating highest moral allocation by political alignment, with the various concentric circles representing distance from the individual. The inner circle, level 1, represents your immediate family. The next circle out, level 2, represents your extended family. 3, your close friends. 4, your distant friends. 5, your acquaintances. 6, anyone you've ever met. 5, all of your countrymen. 8, all people on your continent. 9, all people. 10, all mammals. 11, all animals. 12, all life on Earth. 13, aliens. 14, all life in the universe, including alien plants. 15, all things in the universe, including space rocks. And 16, the entire universe. At first glance, the heat maps appear to show that, on average, right-leaning people allocate their moral concern to those closer to them, their family and friends, while left-leaning people allocate their concern to alien life and space rocks. On the face of it, this data makes right-wingers appear normal, sane, grounded in their communities, while left-wingers appear to be disconnected from reality, having intellectualized their own sense of morality away into a never-ending abstract thought experiment. In some spaces online, replying to a brain-dead progressive opinion by simply posting the graph has become a pretty common thing to do. The right-wing point of view is that the left has such a strong out-group preference that they will sell out those close to them, betray their own culture and morals, and destroy their own society in order to curry favor with those people who are more distant from them, who are foreigners. In essence, the right views the left as xenophilic, and not completely without reason. It's not hard to find leftoids who say that foreign cultures, languages, and peoples are beautiful or valid, while decrying their own culture as stifling and oppressive. This naturally hooks in very well to Aristotle's view that it's the mark of a tyrant to have men of foreign extraction, rather than citizens, as guests at table and companions, feeling that citizens are hostile, but strangers make no claim against him. What Aristotle meant by this, in part anyway, was that people who all come from the same society roughly understand each other's place within it, while the foreigner has no place in society, and so he's not above or below anyone in its hierarchy. We've probably all noticed that, on average, left-wing people are more likely to excuse offenses made by foreigners that would be unforgivable coming from somebody who's actually from their country, because the foreigner can be excused. He didn't know any better. But you're from here. You should be educated enough to be a progressive, and so you are fully culpable for your actions. The left-wing reply to all of this is to say that the study shows that right-wingers are sociopaths, that the expanded moral consideration of the left is simply a product of their greater abilities to be empathic, and the right is simply stunted, childish, selfish, territorial like a wild animal might be. They often point to differences in brain scans between left-wing and right-wing populations, where right-wingers, again on average, have larger amygdalas, making them more sensitive to threats, and more desiring of security than left-wingers, who have a lowered threat response. This is actually pretty interesting to me, because while the right decries the left as suicidally empathic, unable to recognize obvious threats in the diverse populations they hang around with, the right's heightened desire for security is not at all in line with the personality type of the risk-adverse, self-employed small businessman, whom the right tends to hold up as an example. A now-deleted viral tweet proclaiming the moral superiority of the left due to its expanded moral consideration reads as follows: "Woke is the stupidest term ever. Being woke literally just means having empathy. There's nothing bad about caring about problems that affect other people but not you. There's nothing bad about empathy." Of course, this isn't what woke means. See my video on the definition of woke for that. But even if we're talking colloquially and not politically, woke originally came from Black vernacular, and it simply meant to be aware of social issues, especially with regards to race. The connection to empathy there is kind of tenuous. So, which of these two views of the heat map is the truth? Are left-wingers actually idealistic sheltered children who have misplaced empathy for everyone and everything, and they're constantly having their feelings hurt by a cold, harsh reality? Or are right-wingers not empathetic enough, ignoring injustices or sometimes outright causing them, because their moral circles are so restrictive that they actually fail to recognize other people as people? Well, on the extreme ends of the spectrum, both of these things are true. It's not hard to find some communist who sees virtue in his own self-destruction, or some reactionary who's willing to strip away the rights of people who aren't sufficiently like him. But beyond those fringes, the conversation's actually a lot more complicated. To start off with, when the rightoids cite this graph, they often get it wrong. Here's an example of what I mean. Intensity equals consideration. This means prioritization, which translates to intensity of allegiance. If one's moral allegiance is greater to a foreigner than their own family because they abstract the foreigner to represent the whole of man, that means they're willing to sacrifice familial and friendship ties in service of their moral ideal. This is actually incorrect. That is not what the study says. I don't blame people for thinking that it does, though. Lots of people get this wrong. I've gotten it wrong in past videos. Sargon even kind of got it wrong in his video on this topic.
The Liberals' constituency of greatest moral concern were the preposterous categories of 12 to 15.
Though he did get it right a couple sentences later.
Liberals were more likely to weigh the moral value of outgroups and ingroups as equal, with conservatives as the opposite.
For the people who actually contributed their answers to the study, this is what they were given. Notice that it says, please select the extent of your moral circle, meaning not the location where you place the majority of your moral concern, but rather the outer limit of your moral concern. Most people look at the heat map and think, where it's more red is where there's more moral concern. Therefore, righties place more moral concern on lower numbers than higher numbers, and lefties place more moral concern on higher numbers than lower numbers. But that's not what this study is actually measuring. The form explicitly points out that the number you select includes the numbers below it as well, meaning if you select 10, all mammals, you are also selecting 1 through 9. So when our guy here, Bugman Hagel, claims the heat map shows the left has a greater moral allegiance to the foreigner than his own family, that's not true. Rather, the graph shows that both the left and the right have moral consideration for their family and friends, but on average, only left-leaning people additionally have moral consideration for others outside of their own friend group. Basically, the study doesn't show what you care about most, it shows what the maximum boundary of your care is. As far as I can tell, there's nothing in the data that shows that left-leaning people care about the lowered number circles less than the higher numbered ones. In fact, if we return to the study where the meme came from and check out figure 1, we can actually see some evidence of the opposite. This measures love of family, love of friends, and love of everyone else, based on political alignment. The red line represents love of family, and yes, on average, the more right-wing you are, the more you love your family. The left scored a little bit lower, for reasons that I think are interesting, but are a topic of another video. Just as predictably, on the blue line, the love of all other people, the right scored lower while the left scored higher. No surprises there either. However, the green line, love of friends, it's actually pretty close all the way through. Center right scores the lowest, with center and center left being slightly higher, far right being slightly higher than that, and far left being slightly higher still. If the heat map meme were accurate as the right wing uses it, it would show that they prefer their friends more than the left does, and the data just doesn't bear that out. However, the larger moral circle doesn't simply mean that left-leaning people are just better at empathy or morality or something, that they somehow have this wider capacity to care about others, or a deeper well of consideration to draw from, though some people on the left have taken to interpreting the data that way. The left-wing response to the right-wing view that lefties simply love foreigners and hate their families and their culture and themselves is to say that moral concern is not a zero-sum game. It's their view that people don't just run out of empathy or something. For example, you don't love your children less because you love your husband or wife more, and you don't suddenly have extra love to hand around because you had a falling out with a friend or something. Rather, each individual has a separate and independent level of concern that you allocate to. This position was expressed most concretely by the Slate Star Codex guy, who said, "I went on a walk and saw a child drowning in the river. I was going to jump in and save him when someone reminded me that I really should care about family members more than strangers. So I let him drown," which of course was replied to by posting more heat map memes, rather than actually grappling with his objection. Memes are funny, but they're not answers to real questions, so let's actually consider it. Going back to the original study again, right after the heat map, which is labeled as figure 5, but is study 3A in the text, you can find this passage. One caveat to study 3A is that we constrain the number of units the participants could assign to each group, forcing them to distribute moral concern in a zero-sum fashion, meaning the more concern they allocate to one circle, the less they allocate to another. To examine whether a similar pattern would emerge without this constraint, we conducted study 3B to test whether the effect would replicate using unlimited units. Even when their allocations were not constrained, the same pattern replicated such that liberals distribute empathy towards broader circles and conservatives distribute empathy towards smaller circles. And then figure 6 shows this data, where even when the study explicitly says you have an unlimited amount of moral concern this time around, the right wing applied their moral concern more locally and the left wing applied it more universally. What this means is, if we ever got those fancy post-scarcity Star Trek replicators, and could house, feed, and clothe everyone with minimal effort, left-leaning people would be more likely to want to do it, and right-leaning people would be more likely to not want to do it. But what it also means is that right-leaning people, even in times of extreme abundance, still focus their moral consideration on more local spheres. Probably because they believe, correctly I think, that the good times don't last forever. A storm is always on the horizon, no matter how far out. You should always stockpile away a little bit of excess for a rainy day, and help those people who are closest to you because they'll be the ones who help you when you need it. In essence, the right is simply more community focused than the left is. Again, very broadly speaking. This actually reminds me of a video I made years ago, where I documented an argument that I was having with a socialist, who believed that saving up a bit of extra for a rainy day was reactionary, because in the socialist utopia, everything will be micromanaged such that bad times will simply never exist. Of course, in the real world, both positions have their virtue. The right-wingers understand that fate and fortune move in cycles, and when you've hit a breakaway, you should prepare for the next time the hammer comes down. The left-wingers understand that other people in other places aren't actually that different from us. They still need food and shelter and clothing. They still care about their kids and want to see them grow up healthy and happy and take a respectable place in their society, even if what that place is differs from culture to culture. People from other parts of the world aren't simply unknowable to us. Rightist frugality is neither superior nor inferior to leftist empathy. They both have their time and place, where deploying one and setting aside the other is appropriate. Nonetheless, I like Taftaj's take on the whole thing. The fact that liberals and conservatives both believe this graph proves their moral righteousness is great evidence the data is right. Basically what she's saying is, even though the heat map data doesn't actually completely say what the heat map meme says it does, the fact that right-wingers use the meme to say that leftists have an extreme out-group preference to the point of lacking self-preservation, while left-wingers use the meme to say that rightists lack the ability to understand moral concerns beyond their own sphere, and so they are morally inferior, means that both groups accept the validity of the meme's underlying message, even if that message is not in line with the data. They both accept the meme's characterization of the two sides. They simply view their position within the meme as the correct one, and the other position as incorrect. So Taftaj says there's probably something to it. Remember that whole "there's nothing wrong with empathy shitlord" thing from earlier? That is technically true. Having empathy is a normal part of the human experience. It is natural to see other people suffering and feel something. At the same time, there's a ton of people out there who seek to manipulate your empathy to get you to agree to things that are otherwise actually pretty bad. For example, leftists regularly virtue signal about the current trend with very safe, slogan-friendly opinions, an action that costs them little and allows them to reap social rewards. They blast right-wingers for their bigotry, whether it's real or imagined, because being a bigot is bad and being against bigotry is good. But the more you think about this, the more complicated it gets. For example, let's go back to old reliable. Are you for trans rights? I guess, should trans people have rights? Like human rights all people have because they're human, sure, of course, that seems obvious to me. But when they say trans rights, they don't simply mean the set of rights that non-trans people also have, but rather other things that you may or may not agree with. On the one hand, there is no argument to ban transitioning for adults. They're adults, the government should leave them alone. Even if you personally disagree with it, it's their body, their life. It's none of your business what they do. But should the government ban transitioning for children? Well, now the topic is a lot more contentious. But to the trans activist, both of these things are bundled within the package of trans rights. And if you reject part of the package, even if you accept the other parts, you must simply hate trans people. You don't think they should have rights. You're not extending your moral consideration to them as fellow human beings. Therefore, you lack empathy. In this way, the leftist expanded moral circle is positioned as the superior morality, with right-wingers being restrictive and oppressive in their exclusion. And since the leftist moral system extends out far beyond trans people, and in fact covers all forms of human difference, you get wacky exchanges like this, where the YouTuber Technicals was talking about some drama in the animation community, where two people had a polyamorous relationship, and still one of them cheated on the polycule. Seeing a cheating scandal in a polyamorous relationship is like seeing a fat kid at a buffet. Good luck on your weight loss journey or whatever. So you're like polyphobic? Excuse me, I believe the word you're searching for is normal. I think normal people have empathy. What does empathy have to do with any of this, little bro? Oh, criticizing the on-the-face hilarity of cheating in a fucking polycule is apparently bullying, because you recognize a difference in behavior between two demographics, and the empathetic route is to view those differences as socially imposed. But since you're making fun of them, your view of their sexual dysfunction makes you a right-wing shitlord chud. Do you guys recall when AOC did that photo op back during Trump's first term, where she posed crying for the cameras? Lefty media back then ate that shit up and made the photos out to be like she was peering through the fence into an ICE concentration camp, watching the extermination of little brown kids right before her very eyes, and everyone was blasting Trump for making her cry and how terrible it all was. And then it turned out that she actually wasn't even looking at anything at all. It was just the fucking road leading into Mexico. And on the other side of the fence was a protest of people who had no legal right to enter into the States, nonetheless demanding to be let in. These photos were often paired with other unrelated pictures from different times and places, of random foreign-looking people enduring various hardships, usually coupled with the demand that if you're a good person, you'll feel empathy for these people. And if you feel empathy, that means you must do as they say, which means let them in, even if it's illegal. Once again, the right wing replied with memes. I recall seeing this one floating around back then, and now that illegals are getting deported again, it's making a comeback. It's an MS Paint drawing of a crying brown guy with the caption, 14 heartbreaking photos that'll make you say fuck having borders and law and shit. This is a common position among left-leaning people who weaponize empathy. Who cares about law or procedure or the Constitution or status or sovereignty? None of that human-made shit matters in the face of actual suffering. Also, their suffering requires that you let them in, give them a bunch of money, and let them do whatever they want. The craziest example of this attitude isn't actually American, but again, if you've been following these various migrant crisis stories, you'll probably remember this one from back in 2017, where there was a group of migrant children in Sweden who apparently fell into coma-like states, where the only cure for their condition was a residency permit. Yeah, I don't know about this one, Chief. What ties all of this together is a concept known as toxic empathy. That is when a person, generally a leftist, makes appeals to empathy to get other people to fulfill increasingly more intrusive demands. And if you object to the intrusion, it can't be for any of the reasons that you might actually have. It's because you lack empathy. And if you lack empathy, that means your circles of moral consideration are restrictive. You don't view those other people as actually being people, and therefore you're a right-wing bigot, which of course makes you a Nazi. Once again, this reminds me of another conversation I had, more recent this time, where a few weeks back a leftoid over on Blue Sky made the claim that a country having any immigration standards whatsoever is fascist. I'm not talking about highly restrictive standards, I'm not talking about standards that exclude specific ethnicities or religions or political affiliations. The mere existence of a border or an immigration policy, or necessarily of the government itself, is somehow fascist. Man, and the right always tell me that the left is somehow pro-state. Doesn't look like it to me. Toxic empathy is basically when a leftist considers themselves to be superior because of their expanded empathy, as per the heatmap meme, and uses their superiority to attempt to browbeat others into taking up their moral positions, pushing them more leftward as a result. The craziest faction of the right wing has responded by declaring empathy to be sinful. No, really, the phrase sin of empathy went viral a couple weeks before the heatmap became a meme, after that one female bishop gave Trump a dressing down in the post-inauguration prayer service that happens after every presidential election at the Washington National Cathedral. This post is what kicked it off. Do not commit the sin of empathy. This snake is God's enemy and yours too. She hates God and his people. You need to properly hate in response. She is not merely deceived but a deceiver. Your eye shall not pity. There's a larger conversation here that again is beyond the scope of this video. But if you go very far right in the discourse right now, much further to the right than Trump is, you will find a group of people who think that Christianity is basically this cucked, progressive, sometimes they throw in Jewish religion, preaching forgiveness and love towards the downtrodden, prostitutes and lepers, and they believe that society should adopt other spiritual traditions that reject empathy entirely in favor of a strict authoritarian deity who craves honor, war, and aggression. Some of these sin of empathy people are actually not believers in the Christian God at all, and simply want to subvert the church. Others do believe, but are moving into a more radical view of their own religion, as they recognize that Jesus' teachings do indeed include forgiveness, and they have yet to fully complete that thought. But once again, because the Nazis had an incredible lack of empathy, as well as their weird anti-Christian occult beliefs, lacking empathy at all apparently makes you a fascist. To anybody who is not insane and not ideologically captured one way or the other, there is obviously a middle ground here. Yes, toxic empathy is real. Empathy can be weaponized to get you to comply with stuff that is terrible by tugging on your heartstrings. Yes, if you lack empathy entirely, you'll also do stuff that is terrible by having you completely disregard the humanity of others. Both extremes are bad. Once again, the centrist is right. The golden mean wins. It always wins, guys. It's important to be empathetic. It's just as important to not let your empathy control you and to not let yourself be manipulated by it. However, if we dig down even deeper, it's actually pretty easy to find examples that go completely counter to the heatmap meme, even though both the left and the right accept it as accurate. Remember, the meme says that the left has more empathy and the right has less empathy. The left views themselves as morally superior and the right as sociopathic. The right views themselves as realistic and the left as naive. And yet, there are many examples where, against the meaning of the meme, the left has a complete lack of empathy and disregards others, while the right actually employs toxic empathy in order to manipulate others. Let's begin with that first one since it's actually easier to understand. The left has taken up empathy towards drug users as one of its big moral pushes. Addiction is not a moral failing, it's a healthcare failing. Decriminalizing drugs will free people from unnecessary government restrictions on their lives, that sort of thing. And yet, whether it's Jordan Peterson coming down from a benzo addiction, or Elon Musk and ketamines, whatever the case may be, if the addict is a person the left is opposed to politically, their morality goes completely out the window. Or how about mental illness? Again, the left is all about empathy towards people with depression or ADHD, or victims of abuse, people with autism, whatever, as opposed to those apparently immoral, sociopathic right-wingers who think that victims should just get over it. However, whenever somebody's autism or abuse triggers or whatever leads to that individual saying or doing or believing something that is not progressive, all of the left's tolerance and understanding completely vanishes. That depth of understanding closes up when it leads to a politics that the left rejects. It becomes a shallow, surface-level analysis of assuming bigotry. Probably the most obvious example of this I can think of is when Sweet Anita, a streamer with Tourette's, involuntarily said "gas the Jews" on stream, and leftists brigaded her channel and temporarily got it taken down because she was apparently a Nazi. Speaking of Nazis, that whole punch a Nazi thing is a prime example of all the left's apparent empathetic superiority being sucked out of the room. There's never any attempt to understand the Nazi, to get to know him, to realize that maybe he holds these terrible beliefs because he was abused as a kid, or his family life was fucked up, or he's poor, or whatever. Free speech for a long time was a leftist virtue until it wasn't. Bodily autonomy is a leftist virtue until it isn't. The reason that tired joke phrase, "so much for the tolerant left," became a right-wing meme until it was beaten into the ground is because throughout the 2010s it became obvious that leftists don't actually have much more empathy than rightists. They simply claim that they do. And of course, this whole thing operates in reverse for the rightists as well. They talk about their more realistic and grounded allocations of morality, and yet they'll still make moral judgments towards you if you do what a person with a small moral circle would actually do. Some of the stuff is obviously just memeing, like when the right-wing pundit account Libs of TikTok got faux offended at leftists dead-naming the Gulf of America. Yeah, I get the joke. But it's not all memes, there's some real outrage here. Even though Libs of TikTok made their name mocking the excesses of trans weirdos online, they're now outraged that a leftist dares to mock RFK and his spasmodic dysphonia condition. How dare you! Dude, what the fuck is this pearl-clutching bullshit? You're Libs of fucking TikTok. Your whole thing is making fun of people. If this were a right-wing TikToker mocking Biden for being old or whatever, you'd be laughing your ass off. Suddenly not giving a shit about people outside of your moral circle is a sin on the right? Since fucking when? Not according to the heat maps. Oh, apparently liberals are sick, evil people for mocking JD Vance's mom's addiction problems? Hey, hold on. How many times have right-wing accounts posted pictures of streets filled with homeless drug addicts, talking about how they're a social blight and need to be cleaned up? I mean, I want the heroin enjoyers off the street too, but now suddenly it's too far to talk about this shit when it's somebody on your side? How many right-wingers mocked Ryan Carson, a guy who was murdered because, ironically, he was a left-wing white BLM activist who was stabbed to death defending his girlfriend from the exact type of crazy homeless black dude he spent his life advocating for? Well, okay, none of us knew who Ryan Carson was. The heat map says he's not a part of our moral constituency after all. Since he's outside of our moral consideration, right-wingers made fun of him endlessly. But did anyone on the right apply that same standard to Corey Comparator when he was murdered at the Trump rally? Did anyone realize that he wasn't within their moral circles either, despite his martyrdom? Did anyone bring up the heat maps then? No, of course not. The most egregious, widespread weaponization of toxic empathy on the right, though, is with regards to the war in Ukraine. Just to be clear, since I haven't spoken too much about this topic on my channel, Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia's the aggressor, Ukraine's the defender, Ukraine has an obvious right to defend themselves like any other country does, and both, per the terms of the Budapest Memorandum and just the moral thing to do, is for the West to assist Ukraine by giving them weapons. If you talk to most right-wingers about this topic, you'll get one of two replies. The first one is they don't want their tax dollars being funneled into Ukraine. America just can't afford it and the money should be spent at home. Personally, I disagree with this. Not because I'm not American, since this logic applies to Canada and the UK and any other country that's currently funding Ukraine, but because the West didn't actually supply that much money. They overwhelmingly gave old weapons. The counterpoint to that from the right is, well, we still need to spend tax dollars to resupply our own stock of weapons then. And yeah, fair enough, but my counter to that counter is that in reality, those taxes are a jobs program, baby. It's American engineers and workers making those new weapons at American companies. That sounds good to me, but okay, fine. America can't afford it, stop sending money to Ukraine, they now unfortunately have to fend for themselves. I don't agree, but at least I understand the position. The second one, however, is fucking crazy. Apparently, according to some right-wingers, wanting to fund Ukraine's defense is somehow prolonging the war, and you must be a bloodthirsty warmonger because you want to force more people to die by allowing Ukraine to defend itself. Of course, the war would end if Russia simply went home. That is the easiest path to peace. Ukraine's not going to march into Russia after them and keep the fight on, but that's not happening, we all know it. The only way you can possibly believe that funding Ukraine's defense leads to more death is if you believe that the alternative, a quick, decisive victory for the Russians, leads to less death. That's only the case if Russian rule would not lead to the extermination of the Ukrainians, which historically has not been the case anytime Ukraine was under Russian control. The rightoids know all about the Holodomor. They've been beating the communists with it for years, but for some reason they've also conveniently forgotten that the Holodomor is a part of a historic trend between Russia and Ukraine, and that there would obviously be more death if Ukraine lost the war. So much for those fabled pattern recognition skills, fellas. But okay, according to at least some part of the right, if you fund the war, even if that means that you fund the defender against the aggressor, you are necessarily cheering at violence and death and you're masturbating over corpses or whatever. This is the same toxic empathy style logic that leftists have employed when they said that Kyle Rittenhouse was a murderer for defending himself, or that homeowners or business owners don't need the Second Amendment, because property is never more important than human lives, guys. And if you happen to read the actual posts of right-wing accounts that specifically make the Mo Forever War claim, not the we can't afford it claim, you will find that they also employ toxic empathy, despite being right-wing and not left-wing. They're saying that if you want to see Ukraine successfully defend itself, that means more death. And how dare you not care about the deaths of Russians and Ukrainians halfway around the world, who are on a completely different continent? And how dare you not just completely give up your morals and do what I tell you, all in the name of preventing more deaths of strangers? The rightoids are browbeating their opponents with their supposed moral superiority stemming from their consideration of people outside of their own local sphere on the heat map. Ukrainians are not within this red circle for American right-wingers. It's toxic fucking empathy all the way down. Let's end with some cringe to cap it all off. This UK lefty said, "The power of this image is its simplicity. It makes us feel uncomfortable, and it should." Attaching a picture that, I don't know, looks like it might be one of those overhead advertisements in a subway, you know what I mean? Anyway, this is the school to prison pipeline, apparently. On the main track, you've got a student who's sent to detention, he's isolated, he's excluded, he eventually drops out of school, and he ends up as a criminal going to prison. The proposed path is instead of punishing with detention, you give a problem student empathy and support, and he'll be successful, as if empathy is simply a resource bar to fill up in a person like food or sleep or whatever. If you just feed him empathy, he'll function properly or something. It couldn't be the case that some students actually need discipline. No, never use the stick, only infinitely more carrots. The stick is fascist. No, just feed him more empathy and he'll function properly. And if he doesn't, feed him even more. Of course, reality is far more complicated, and one-size solutions almost never actually fit all. It's true that some people would just be better off had they been shown empathy instead of exclusion. A lot of bullied people end up being bullies themselves and making new bullies. A lot of abused people end up being abusers themselves and making new abusers. Some people are actually good, but they're down on their luck, and they truly would be able to flourish if you give them a shot. Some people might not actually be lonely or bitter or filled with rage if the world simply treated them a bit more fairly. This kind of thing does actually happen all the time. However, other people do actually just use the kindness of strangers as a tool to get what they want. Some of them are exploiters who suck you dry and move on. Some of them have fundamentally different moral systems than you. Your empathy will be the weakness they use to impose their will on you. And some others are just too damaged to ever be functional, and they'll end up burning you down with them. Not everyone is the stereotype of a blameless victim of society who deep down is just like you and happens to want what you want. Some people are actually just your enemy, whether you recognize them as such or not. As for how you tell the difference between the two, well, neither extreme works for the reasons we've discussed in this video. You could always be empathetic every single time and get completely destroyed. You could never be empathetic and then never make any friends or have any people around you, and watch your heat map get smaller and smaller and smaller as people move on. The heat map meme itself is funny, but it doesn't actually help. The people who posted it aren't even reading it correctly, and they don't understand how in many ways they're actually the same as the people they're making fun of, as soon as you switch the political alignments around. The best chance you've got is wisdom, life experience, building up a quality of character that allows you to judge whether or not the homeless guy shaking a cup at you is going to buy drugs with that money or is actually going to use it to get his life on track. Partisans might claim to have an easy answer, they always do, but like most things, when you really consider it outside of the scope of memes or ideology or incompleted thoughts, there is no easy answer. Cultivate a good sense of character that will allow you to judge other people's intentions at least somewhat accurately, regardless of whether you're close to them or not. That will serve you much better in life than some meme shit about who you're considered close to. After all, sometimes your friends or family just fucking suck.